Welcome to All Angles History. I'm Matt Gorin, and this is episode 4 of our deep dive into the complex and fascinating journey of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh's fight for independence. Today we're uncovering a pivotal moment that could have changed the course of history, a moment nearly 2 decades before the Vietnam War, when the conflict might have been avoided. What if the United States and Vietnam could have taken a different path? This is a story of revolution, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. But it's also a story of missed opportunities and lessons that resonate even now. Are you ready to see history from all angles? 1945, the world was in turmoil. As the Second World War came to an end, Vietnam, a country most couldn't even point to on a map, found itself at a crossroads. The Japanese, who had occupied the country since 1940, were on the verge of defeat. Meanwhile, the French, eager to reclaim their lost empire, sought to reassert control over Indochina. But within this power vacuum, a new force was rising. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, was ready to strike. For Ho Chi Minh, this was the moment he had long anticipated. Decades of discipline, relentless travel, and unwavering focus on one mission had led to this point. Can you imagine what it must have felt like for him? After 40 years of struggle, exile, and sacrifice, the dream of a free Vietnam was within reach. As he moved through the northern mountains and dense forests, Ho Chi Minh met with local leaders, men and women who had fought for years against the Japanese and French occupiers. These leaders were not just military figures, they were village elders, intellectuals, and even farmers who had become hardened by the occupation. They gathered in places like the small village of Pac Bo, nestled in the mountains near the Chinese border, where Ho had set up a secret base. Here, he rallied support, coordinated strategies, and inspired his comrades with the vision of an independent Vietnam. Earlier that year, in February 1945, Ho Chi Minh had written to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt seeking political backing for Vietnam's independence. But why did he do this? Ho's logic was clear. He believed that the United States, a nation that had fought for its own independence from colonial rule, would understand and perhaps even support Vietnam's struggle for independence, for freedom. His letter wasn't just a plea, it was a strategic move to align Vietnam's quest for sovereignty with American ideals. However, the request was ignored. This moment, often overlooked, shows that Ho Chi Minh and perhaps Vietnam were not inherently enemies of the United States. Imagine, 2 decades before the Vietnam War, a different path could have been taken, one where mutual understanding and support might have prevented the devastating conflict that was to come. But history took a different course. In March, as the war raged on, the Japanese occupying forces claimed sovereignty over Vietnam, effectively ending French authority in the region. This was a significant shift, as the Japanese sought to maintain control despite their impending defeat. Then, in April, President Roosevelt died, and Harry S. Truman took over as President of the United States, a change that would have profound implications for Vietnam's future. President Truman's administration was less sympathetic to anti-colonial movements, and this shift in leadership would shape the United States' response to Vietnam in the years to come. On August 13, 1945, under Ho Chi Minh's direction, the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution, a coordinated uprising that spread like wildfire from remote rural strongholds to key urban centers. But this was not a spontaneous revolt. It was a carefully crafted strategy designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of both the Japanese and the French. Why were they vulnerable? Let's set the stage. In May 1940, France had been overrun by Nazi Germany. The French government was humiliated and its grip on its colonies weakened. Meanwhile, Japan, having occupied Vietnam as part of its broader imperial ambitions, was now facing total defeat after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, 1945. The Japanese forces in Vietnam were left leaderless and demoralized, yet they still occupied the land. France, weakened by its own occupation, struggled to regain control over Indochina. But why were they even here? For France, Vietnam was a jewel of the empire, rich in resources like rubber and rice. As for Japan, they were holding on to Vietnam under the direction of their military command, trying to maintain order amidst their own impending collapse. On August 14th, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied forces, but Japanese forces in Vietnam remained in control temporarily, awaiting the arrival of Allied forces to oversee their withdrawal. Hanoi, the capital city, was the cradle of Vietnam aspirations because it was here, in the ancient city by the Red River, that the spirit of resistance had been nurtured for generations. The Chinese communists, themselves emerging from a brutal civil war, saw in Ho Chi Minh a kindred spirit, another leader fighting for the liberation of his people. They supplied the Viet Minh with weapons and support, hoping to spread the revolutionary flame throughout Asia. In Hanoi, the fighting was intense and unpredictable, a chaotic struggle for control of the city's narrow ancient streets. But what does it mean when we say the fighting was fierce and chaotic? Picture this: the narrow streets, lined with ancient temples and colonial buildings, now transformed into a labyrinth of violence. The Viet Minh, outnumbered and outgunned, relied on guerrilla tactics. Imagine young fighters, some barely more than teenagers, ambushing Japanese patrols in the dead of night, using whatever weapons they had: rifles from World War I, grenades made from scraps, and bamboo spears. They would strike quickly, inflicting damage, then vanish into the network of alleys, leaving behind confusion and fear. Civilians too played a vital role. They hid fighters in their homes, provided food, and passed along intelligence about enemy movements. Every street corner, every alleyway could become a trap. So where did they push the Japanese and French forces? The Viet Minh slowly pushed them back toward the city outskirts, out of the urban strongholds that they once dominated. Were Japan and France on the same team? No, not at all. They were enemies, with the Japanese occupying Vietnam and the French desperate to reclaim it. Yet, in this moment, they were both adversaries to the Viet Minh's cause. Ho Chi Minh, though not physically present in every skirmish, was the guiding force behind these tactics. He believed deeply in the power of the people, often reminding his comrades that nothing is more precious than independence and liberty. This philosophy underpinned every action taken during the revolution. Despite the odds, the Viet Minh steadily pushed back the Japanese and the remaining French forces, seizing control of the capital by August 19th. August 19th marked the call for a national uprising. By August 30th, Bao Dai, the Japanese-backed puppet emperor of Vietnam, abdicated, symbolizing the collapse of the old order. The Viet Minh swiftly occupied Hanoi, proclaiming a provisional government. This was a turning point. The ancient city, long the heart of Vietnamese culture and political life, was now the center of a new revolution. But the situation was still volatile, and Ho Chi Minh knew that the struggle was far from over. Why did he know this? Ho understood that while the Viet Minh had won key battles, the real challenge was just beginning. Foreign powers, particularly the French, were not going to let go of Vietnam easily. The abdication of Bao Dai and the formation of a provisional government were symbolic victories, but Ho knew that the fight for international recognition and the defense of this newly found independence would be a long and arduous journey. On September 2nd, 1945, as Japanese delegates signed the Instrument of Surrender on the USS Missouri, effectively ending World War II, another significant event was unfolding in Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd of 400,000 in Ba Dinh Square and proclaimed the independence of Vietnam. Drawing inspiration from the American Declaration of Independence, he declared, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Ho's speech was a powerful message to the world, but particularly to the United States. Why did Ho Chi Minh choose these words, echoing the very principles that had inspired America's own struggle for independence? Was he reaching out to the United States, hoping to find an ally in his quest for Vietnamese sovereignty? Consider these additional points from his speech. Ho denounced the French for exploiting Vietnam's resources and for collaborating with the Japanese, leading to the starvation of millions of Vietnamese. He also highlighted the hypocrisy of French claims to liberty, equality, and fraternity, given their brutal colonial rule. For the Vietnamese people who had endured decades of colonial oppression, hearing these words must have been both inspiring and bittersweet, a declaration of their right to freedom, yet a reminder of the long road still ahead. Yet even as Ho Chi Minh's words resonated in Ba Dinh Square, new challenges were on the horizon. On September 13th, British forces arrived in southern Vietnam to oversee the disarmament and withdrawal of the Japanese. Meanwhile, around 180,000 Chinese nationalist soldiers entered Hanoi, ostensibly to accept the Japanese surrender. These foreign troops added another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. Imagine how exhausting this must have been for a people who just wanted to rule themselves, one thing after another force stepping in, another challenge to face. The Vietnamese were caught in a whirlwind of shifting powers, each bringing its own set of demands and difficulties. On September 22nd, 1,400 French soldiers entered Saigon and launched an attack on Viet Minh members and civilians, reigniting the conflict. 2 days later, on September 24th, members of Binh Duyen, a Vietnamese criminal syndicate turned paramilitary group, massacred 200 Europeans in Saigon. The violence spiraled out of control, and by October, 35,000 French soldiers had arrived in southern Vietnam to restore colonial rule. The Binh Duyen, known for their control of Saigon's underworld, were not aligned with Ho Chi Minh's vision for Vietnam. Their actions were driven by criminal interest and were not sanctioned by the Viet Minh leadership. The hope of a peaceful transition was slipping away as the reassertion of French power in the South threatened to undo everything the Viet Minh had fought for. Ho Chi Minh, recognizing the dire situation, reached out to the international community. In October 1945, he wrote a letter to President Harry Truman, urging the U.S. to support Vietnam's independence and warning of the consequences of allowing France to regain control. In his letter, Ho stated, "Vietnam is qualified by the Atlantic Charter to be represented at the Advisory Commission." The Atlantic Charter, signed in 1941, was a pivotal document that outlined the Allies' goals for the post-war world, including the right of all peoples to choose their own government, a principle Ho believed should apply to Vietnam. The Advisory Commission was a body set up to help guide the post-war restructuring of Asia, and Ho argued that Vietnam, having fought alongside the Allies against the Japanese, deserved a seat at the table. He highlighted the betrayal of the Vietnamese people by the French, who had sold Indochina to Japan and betrayed the Allies. Despite his appeals, the response from the U.S. was tepid at best. The lack of support from a country that had itself fought for independence was a bitter pill to swallow for Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people. As the year drew to a close, the hopes of the August Revolution were hanging in the balance. Vietnam was declared independent, yet the struggle for true sovereignty was only just beginning. Foreign powers were circling, and the international response was uncertain. The Vietnamese people, wary but resolute, knew that their fight was far from over. What would come next? How would Vietnam navigate the treacherous waters of post-war politics and power struggles? These questions loomed large as the country stood on the brink of a new chapter. As we reflect on these events, we must consider the profound impact of these battles, not just on those who fought and died, but on the very fabric of a nation emerging from the shadows of colonialism. The August Revolution was a turning point, a moment when the impossible became reality. But the price of that reality was high, and the future of Vietnam remained uncertain. And how curious it is that the U.S., a nation born from a similar struggle for independence, would later engage in a prolonged and costly conflict in this very land. Was it hubris or a failure to recognize the lessons of history? In the chapters ahead, we will explore the next phase of Vietnam's journey, as the Chinese communists, fresh from their own revolution, step onto the stage, and as foreign powers jockey for influence, Vietnam's fight for independence will take on new dimensions. But what will be the cost? Will Vietnam's dream of freedom endure, or will it be crushed under the weight of international politics? The answers and all angles lie just ahead.